Summer 1943. The vast plains of western Russia shimmered under the July sun. Quiet, deceptively peaceful. Wheat fields rolled toward the horizon, broken only by the blackened skeletons of tanks left behind from the brutal winter battles. Yet, beneath that silence, the earth itself seemed to tremble, as if it knew that soon fire and steel would consume it once again. The world was holding its breath. For months, two titans had been locked in a death struggle, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And now, on a bulge of land near a city called Kursk, they were preparing for something unprecedented. More men, more tanks, more artillery, more mines. The largest clash of armored forces in human history was about to begin. The shadow of Stalingrad. Only months earlier, the German Sixth Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad, a blow so devastating that even Hitler's closest generals whispered of doom. But Adolf Hitler was not ready to accept defeat. He saw Kursk not just as a battle, but as redemption. If we can strike swiftly and destroy the enemy at Kursk, the Eastern Front can be stabilized. The initiative will be ours again. Across the map in Moscow, Joseph Stalin listened to reports from his generals, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky. They spoke of the German buildup, divisions refitting, Tiger tanks gathering, aircraft assembling. Stalin only asked one question: when will they attack? The Soviet leader already knew the answer: soon. But this time, unlike the dark summer of 1941, the Red Army would be ready. A bulge on the map. The front line that summer formed a giant protrusion in central Russia, a bulge of land 250 kilometers wide and 160 deep, centered around Kursk. The Germans called it the Kursk salient. To Hitler, it looked like an opportunity. To his generals, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. If the Wehrmacht could attack from both north and south, from Oriel and Belgorod, and pinch off the bulge, they could encircle hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. It would be another grand encirclement like the glory days of 1941. That was the dream. But the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, already knew everything, thanks to intelligence from British codebreakers and their own spies inside the German military. Stalin knew exactly where and when the Germans would strike. So while the Germans prepared their attack, the Soviets prepared to absorb it. The German plan, Operation Citadel. The code name was Operation Citadel. It was to be Hitler's last great offensive in the East, a decisive battle to break Soviet strength once and for all. But not everyone was convinced. General Heinz Guderian, architect of the blitzkrieg, warned, "The attack's success is doubtful. We risk throwing away the last of our reserves." Field Marshal von Manstein, the brilliant commander of Army Group South, was cautious too. He wanted to strike earlier, in April, before the Soviets could dig in. But Hitler delayed, waiting for more tanks, especially the new Panther and Tiger models. Each delay gave the Red Army more time. By July, they had transformed the Kursk salient into one of the most fortified regions on Earth.
The Soviet trap. The Soviets built 8 defensive belts, each layered with minefields, trenches, and artillery zones. Over 1 million mines were buried, 3,000 miles of trenches dug, 20,000 guns positioned, 300,000 civilians conscripted to fortify the land. Entire towns vanished under camouflaged nets and gun pits. Soviet engineers created corridors of death, killing zones where tanks would be channeled into ambushes. Behind the front lines, the Red Army massed its own striking force. the steppe front, held in reserve for the moment the Germans would be exhausted. The trap was set. The calm before battle. By late June, both sides were staring across the front lines, waiting for the order. German reconnaissance planes flew constantly, photographing Soviet positions, but the forests and camouflaged trenches hid most of the truth. Soviet scouts watched the German armored columns massing in the distance, hearing the rumble of engines day and night. In the north, General Model's Ninth Army assembled around Orel. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Kempf's army detachment gathered near Belgorod. Between them stood over 1 million Soviet soldiers under Generals Rokossovsky and Vatutin. The stage was set. On the night of July 4th, 1943, as fireworks celebrated Independence Day across the Atlantic, the fields around Kursk lit up for another reason. Artillery flashes flickered across the horizon. At 2:20 a.m., the Red Army opened fire, a massive preemptive bombardment. They had guessed the German start time almost perfectly. The thunder of Soviet guns rained destruction on German assembly areas, killing men and wrecking vehicles before the attack even began. But it was too late to stop it now. July 5th, 1943, the storm breaks. At dawn, 9,000 German guns answered back. The Battle of Kursk had begun.
Wave after wave of Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, pounding Soviet lines. The ground shook as German Panthers, Tigers, and Ferdinand tank destroyers rolled forward, the mightiest armored force ever assembled by Nazi Germany. The earth quaked beneath their treads. For the men on both sides, it felt like the end of the world. The German spearheads pushed into the Soviet defenses. In the north, progress was slow, bogged down by minefields and relentless artillery fire. In the south, near Belgorod, the 4th Panzer Army made better headway. The Luftwaffe swarmed overhead, hammering Soviet positions. But every kilometer was paid for in blood and steel. German tanks advanced through narrow corridors cleared of mines, while Soviet gunners zeroed in on them with 76mm anti-tank guns. Infantry followed behind, often finding themselves in hand-to-hand combat in the ruins of villages and the edges of wheat fields turned to ash. By nightfall, the Germans had advanced barely a few miles. The lightning war of 1941 was gone. In its place was a grinding, attritional nightmare. Men inside the machines. For the men fighting inside those tanks, the battle was personal hell. Inside a German Panther, temperatures soared above 50 degrees Celsius. The smell of fuel, sweat, and cordite filled the air. Crews shouted over the roar of engines and gunfire, shells slamming into armor inches away. In Soviet T-34s, crews fought with crude optics and limited radio communication, but they had numbers and experience. Many had fought from Moscow to Stalingrad and knew how to survive. Each tank became a world of its own, 4 or 5 men locked in a steel coffin, navigating chaos and death. The battle intensifies. Day after day, the front burned. The Germans pushed forward, gaining ground, but at enormous cost. The Soviets fell back deliberately, trading space for time, absorbing the blow. In the north, Rokovsky's lines held firm. In the south, Vatutin struggled to contain the powerful armored thrust led by General Hoth, and especially the elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser. Their objective, the town of Prokhorovka. And it was there, on July 12th, that the world would witness the greatest tank battle in history, where over 1,500 armored vehicles would clash in a single day.
July 6th, 1943. The fields near Kursk were already scorched black. The smell of burned oil and cordite drifted for miles. For the soldiers on the front, time blurred. Day and night mixed into a single unending roar of engines, explosions, and screams. The Battle of Kursk was now in full fury. To the German High Command, this was meant to be the decisive strike, a thunderbolt that would cripple the Red Army before the Allies could invade Western Europe. Hitler had called it his iron fist against Bolshevism. But even as his panzers advanced, the reality was far different from the clean lines drawn on maps in Berlin. The northern thrust, Model's bloody struggle. In the north, Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army faced the brunt of the Soviet Central Front under General Rokossovsky. Model commanded over 300,000 men, backed by more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns, including the massive Ferdinand tank destroyers, each weighing 70 tons and boasting an 88mm gun capable of killing a T-34 at 2 kilometers. But the Ferdinands had a fatal flaw: no machine gun, no close defense weapon at all. Soviet infantry quickly learned to let the giant machines pass, then swarm them with grenades and Molotov cocktails. The fields of Ponyri and Ulkovatka turned into graveyards of burning armor. Soviet mine seals slowed the German advance to a crawl. Engineers cleared paths under artillery fire. Tanks advanced only to be met by new mine belts, new ambushes, new layers of defense. By July 8th, after 3 days of brutal fighting, Model's troops had advanced barely 12 kilometers. His men were exhausted. Ammunition was running low. Every gain came at a staggering price. And still Rokossovsky held the line. The sudden thrust. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. In the south, however, the Germans were making progress. Field Marshal Erich von Monstein, commander of Army Group South, was a master of maneuver warfare. He believed the southern offensive could achieve what the north could not. Leading his attack was General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, supported by Hauser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps, 3 elite divisions, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, das Reich, and Totenkorps. These were the most experienced and well-equipped formations in the Wehrmacht, veterans of Kharkov, Stalingrad, and countless other battles. Their tanks gleamed with fresh camouflage. Their crews believed they could turn the tide.
And the Soviets knew it. A clash of doctrines. Kursk wasn't just the battle of machines, it was a battle of philosophies. The Germans relied on tactical excellence, precise coordination, superior optics, powerful guns, and experienced crews. Their tanks, especially the Tigers, could destroy a T-34 before the Soviet gunners even saw them. The Soviets, on the other hand, relied on strategic depth, overwhelming numbers, resilience, and pre-planned defense in depth. They expected to lose tanks, thousands of them, but they would replace them, and their men would not yield. To the Germans, victory meant breaking through. To the Soviets, victory meant enduring. The sky burns. Above the fields of Kursk, the air war was just as fierce. the Luftwaffe deployed nearly 2,000 aircraft, including the fearsome Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and the sleek FW-190 fighters. For the first few days, they dominated the skies, providing close air support and blasting Soviet positions. But the Soviets had learned from the disasters of 1941 and 1942. The VVS, Soviet Air Force, had improved drastically, better tactics, better aircraft like the Yak-9 and Law-5, and new formations that attacked in waves. By July 10th, the skies over Kursk were filled with thousands of aircraft dogfighting simultaneously, the largest air battles of the Eastern Front. Pilots fought at treetop level, strafing tanks, diving into smoke, dodging anti-aircraft fire. Many never returned. For the soldiers on the ground, the noise never stopped. The earth shook not just from artillery, but from the constant roar of engines above. The pressure builds. By July 10th, the German offensive was reaching its peak. In the north, Models was stalled. In the south, Haas panzers were still advancing, but slower each day. The minefields, the counterattacks, the endless artillery fire, it was taking its toll.
Inside Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters, frustration was growing. Reports were grim. One general remarked, "The Soviets fight like men possessed." But there was no turning back now. The Germans concentrated their might near Prokhorovka, hoping for one decisive breakthrough. If they could punch through there, they could split the Soviet defenses and roll north to link up with Model, trapping the entire Kursk salient. It was a bold plan. It was also a desperate one. Soviet preparations at Prokhorovka. Across the front, Soviet commanders could sense what was coming. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, overseeing the battle from Moscow, ordered General Ratomstrov's 5th Guards tank army to move toward Prokhorovka. Ratomstrov was a fiery, fearless leader, known for leading from the front, often standing in the turret of his T-34 as shells exploded nearby. By July 11th, over 800 Soviet tanks were massing east of Prokhorovka, hidden behind hills and camouflage nets. Their orders were simple: wait for the Germans to strike, then counterattack with everything. The calm before the firestorm. That night, the Soviet tankers prepared their machines. They cleaned their guns, checked their engines, whispered prayers. Some carved messages into the armor, for Moscow, for Stalingrad, for my brother. In the darkness, they could hear the German engines growling across the fields. The men of the Leibstandarte SS division were doing the same, checking ammunition, refueling their Tigers, steeling themselves for the battle to come. At dawn, they would collide in one of the most ferocious armored battles in human history. The German view, the calm before the storm.
For the German crews, Prokhorovka was supposed to be the turning point. Their commanders believed the Soviets were broken. They would sweep through one last defensive line, and victory would be theirs. But even veteran tankers could feel something different. The air felt heavy. The ground rumbled. Soviet artillery had grown louder with each passing hour. One German gunner later recalled, "It was as if the horizon itself was on fire." The Soviet counterattack begins. July 12, 1943. Dawn broke through the smoke and haze, revealing a sky streaked with orange. Then the ground began to shake. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards tank army surged forward. Hundreds of T-34s and Churchill tanks roared across the fields, their engines screaming, their tracks churning up dust and fire. The Soviet radio net crackled with one command: "Steel, steel, steel. Forward." On the other side, the Germans were stunned. They had expected another day of attack, not to be attacked themselves. What followed would become legend. The Battle of Prokhorovka. July 12th, 1943. The sun rose over the fields near the small railway station of Prokhorovka, painting the horizon blood red, as if the earth itself knew what was coming. For days thunder had rolled across the steppe, the clash of artillery, the scream of aircraft, the endless growl of engines. But this morning was different. The noise was deeper, heavier, the kind of sound that men gripped their weapons a little tighter. Because today, the largest armored confrontation in history was about to begin. The opening roar. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the calm shattered. The Soviets struck first. From behind a line of trees and hills east of Prokhorovka, over 800 Soviet tanks roared to life. The ground shook like an earthquake. Their engines, the deep, throaty rumble of T-34s, Churchill heavy tanks, and light T-70s merged into a single deafening growl. On the other side, the Germans were stunned. They had expected another day of attack, not to be attacked themselves. Rotmistrov's charge. General Pavlo Rotmistrov, commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, stood in his command vehicle, watching his division surge forward. He had ordered a full frontal assault, a desperate gamble meant to hit the Germans before they could organize another attack.
His voice crackled over the radio. Forward, close the distance, don't stop to fire, ram them if you must. The Soviet tanks raced ahead at full speed, dust and smoke trailing behind them. German gunners in the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions could hardly believe their eyes. Through their optics, they saw hundreds of T-34s charging headlong toward them. They opened fire. Fire and steel. The valley erupted. Shells screamed through the air, striking tanks and throwing them skyward in flaming arcs. The shockwaves flattened grass and knocked men off their feet. German 88mm cannons and Panzer IVs poured fire into the Soviet wave. Tigers, sitting on higher ground, picked off T-34s from over a mile away, each shot a killing blow. But the Soviet tanks kept coming. They fired on the move, their rounds slamming into the German lines. Dust clouds rose so thick that gunners could hardly see. Visibility dropped to a few hundred meters, sometimes less. The battle dissolved into chaos. Close quarters mayhem. Within minutes, the two forces collided in close range. T-34s smashed through German positions, ramming Panthers and firing point blank. The fields became a hellish maze of wrecks, flames, and black smoke. A German tank commander later wrote, "At one moment, a T-34 burst through the smoke right in front of us. We fired, missed, and before I could reload, it rammed us. Both tanks burned." In many cases, crews had no time to aim. They fired blind, trying to hit shadows moving through the haze. One Soviet tanker described it this: "We could see nothing but dust and fire. I saw a Tiger ahead, its gun turning toward me, and then nothing." The sky joined the battle. Above the carnage, the air was alive with war. Hundreds of aircraft tangled in dogfights. Stukas screamed downward, dropping bombs into the melee, sometimes missing and striking their own side. Soviet IL-2 Sturmovix, called flying tanks, roared in low, firing rockets and cannon shells into German armor columns. The ground was so crowded that pilots reported having to pull up to avoid crashing into tank turrets or columns of smoke. For hours, the entire region was engulfed. Fire on the ground, fire in the sky. The Valley of Death. By mid-morning,
The battlefield near Prokhorovka was an inferno. Smoke blotted out the sun. Burning oil poured from wrecked tanks, forming rivers of flame. The smell of fuel and scorched flesh hung thick in the air. Men crawled from wrecks, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. Others fought with pistols and grenades among burning vehicles. No one could tell who was winning, or even where the front line was. German Tiger tanks were deadly, but the terrain worked against them. The valleys and ravines limited their range and maneuverability. Soviet crews took advantage, closing to short distances where their 76mm guns could penetrate even thick Tiger armor. By noon, Prokhorovka had become a cauldron of steel. Moments of heroism. Amid the carnage, stories of bravery and madness unfolded.
A Soviet platoon commander, Lieutenant Alexander Kurzintsev, led his 3 T-34s straight into a group of German tanks. Outnumbered 5-1, he ordered his men to fire point blank, then ram the survivors. All 3 T-34s were destroyed, but the German column was stopped cold. Elsewhere, Sergeant Dmitry Lavrenenko, already a celebrated tank ace, knocked out 6 German vehicles before his own tank was hit. He kept firing from the wreck until a second shell silenced him. Even on the German side, valor was everywhere. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger I, reportedly destroyed over a dozen Soviet tanks that morning before his own machine was crippled by artillery. He and his crew escaped on foot, covered in soot and blood. By early afternoon, both armies were bleeding, exhausted, and still locked in combat. Commanders in crisis. At his command post, Rotmistrov received chaotic reports. Entire brigades were being wiped out. Radio communications were breaking down. He turned to his staff and said quietly, "This is not a battle. It is a furnace." Yet he refused to stop the assault. The Germans had to be halted, whatever the cost. On the other side, General Hauser of the Leibstandarte was also struggling. His tanks were running out of fuel and ammunition. The Soviets kept sending in fresh waves. Every time the Germans repelled one attack, another came. The battlefield was now littered with over 1,000 burning wrecks, twisted hulks that once held men's hopes, dreams, and lives. The turning point. By early afternoon, the Soviet momentum slowed. The attack had failed to break through, but it had stopped the German advance cold. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, though battered, held its ground, yet they could not move forward either. Rotmistrov had thrown nearly his entire tank army into the fight. Over 300 Soviet tanks were destroyed that day alone. German losses were smaller, perhaps 70 to 100 tanks, but for the first time, the offensive had completely lost its drive. That evening, as darkness fell over the smoking steppe, the firing finally died down. The survivors, on both sides, stumbled among the wrecks, looking for comrades, listening to the distant crackle of fires and the occasional explosion of ammunition cooking off inside destroyed tanks. The once green fields were now a metallic desert, strewn with bodies and wreckage as far as the eye could see. The day after. When dawn came again, the full horror was visible. Over 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns lay wrecked or burning across the battlefield. Crows circled overhead. The air stank of fuel, death, and smoke. German soldiers walked among the ruins, stunned at the scale of the destruction. Soviet engineers were already moving in, clearing wrecks, rescuing wounded, counting the cost.